By the late 15th century, Europe's strongest castles carried a weakness no medieval builder had been trained to see. Their towers still dominated roads, towns, and valleys, yet improved cannon could turn that height into a precise target. Gunpowder did more than threaten individual fortresses. It challenged the military system that had organized power for centuries. The urgent question was no longer how to build a taller wall, but how to survive when height itself invited destruction. Roads, tax districts, frontier claims, and campaign plans all depended upon defenses that artillery now placed in doubt. The answer would become the trace italienne, the angular star fort that reshaped warfare for roughly 300 years. The medieval castle had been designed for an older contest between gravity, stone, and men approaching on foot. High walls exposed attackers to arrows, stones, and other missiles, while ladders and rams struggled beneath the defenders. Round towers strengthened corners, moats slowed an assault, and stored provisions allowed a small garrison to outlast a larger army. In that world, vertical scale created tactical advantage and projected political authority across the surrounding countryside. Defenders concentrated force at narrow approaches, while attackers struggled to bring superior numbers against the same protected point. A fortress could delay a campaign for months, making possession of strong walls central to the survival of states. Artillery reversed that logic because a cannonball delivered concentrated force horizontally into masonry built to resist very different pressures. Tall walls presented broad targets, and their relatively narrow mass could fracture after repeated impacts near the same point. Stone broke outward, unsupported sections sagged, and a breach could open where ladders had once seemed almost useless. Round towers created another problem because their curves did not always let defenders sweep the neighboring wall base with fire. Once rubble filled the ditch below, collapsed masonry could even create a rough approach toward the opening. The castle had not suddenly become defenseless, but its inherited geometry was becoming increasingly expensive to preserve. The warning became impossible to dismiss at Constantinople in 1453, where the Byzantine capital depended on the celebrated Theodosian walls. Those defenses had protected the city through repeated attacks for more than 1,000 years. Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II brought large bombards, including a bronze cannon reportedly cast by the Hungarian engineer Urban. Accounts describe one weapon more than 5 meters long, capable of throwing stone balls weighing about 550 kilograms. Moving and reloading the largest bombards was slow, but concentrated strikes created damage that defenders had to repair constantly. After weeks of bombardment and assault, Constantinople fell on May 29, 1453, before 2 full months had passed. The fall did not prove that every old wall would collapse immediately, but it changed the terms of military planning. If one of the world's most famous defensive systems could be breached, lesser fortifications required serious reconsideration. That realization mattered especially in northern Italy, where Florence, Venice, Milan, and the Papal States competed through alliances and mercenary armies. Their rivalries placed cities under recurring threat, just as gunpowder weapons were becoming more reliable and destructive. A solution that failed in one campaign could expose a wealthy city before the next alliance had time to form. Italian rulers therefore faced the central engineering problem early, repeatedly, and with unusually high political stakes. The first response was not a perfect star shape drawn in a single moment of inspiration. Engineers experimented by lowering exposed masonry, thickening vulnerable sections, and placing earth behind walls to absorb impact. At the papal port of Civitavecchia, older defenses were reduced in height and increased in depth. A lower profile offered artillery less surface, while greater mass gave each impact more material to cross. Packed earth behind the masonry also limited the sudden brittle failure that made unsupported stone so vulnerable. Sloped surfaces also encouraged some shots to glance upward instead of transferring their full force directly into vertical stone. Pisa supplied a dramatic field test in 1500, when Florentine and French forces battered the city's medieval defenses. As masonry failed, the defenders built a sloping rampart of packed earth behind the damaged wall. Solid stone shot that shattered rigid blocks often buried itself in the softer, deeper material. The incline also redirected part of the bombardment, rather than receiving every strike squarely. Laborers could reshape damaged earth more readily than they could quarry and fit replacement blocks during an active siege. The improvisation helped Pisa hold, demonstrating that earth could perform a defensive task once associated almost entirely with dressed stone. Padua carried the experiment further in 1509 under the Venetian monk engineer Fra Giocondo. Preparing for a French attack, he deliberately removed sections of vulnerable medieval wall rather than waiting for artillery to destroy them. A broad ditch and low ramparts replaced the exposed vertical barrier, while projecting platforms extended defensive fire into the approaches. French guns achieved limited effect against the thick earthworks, and repeated assaults met fire from the flanks. The new arrangement required attackers to cross difficult ground before they could exploit any local damage. When the attackers withdrew, the basic principles of a new defensive language had survived a second demanding test. Together, Pisa and Padua revealed a reversal that medieval architecture had never been designed to accommodate. Against improved cannon, lower could be stronger than higher, earth could be tougher than stone, and angles could outperform curves. Yet those lessons mattered only if engineers could combine them into a complete system. The decisive invention was not simply a thicker wall, but a plan in which every section protected another section. Isolated improvements could still leave gaps where attackers sheltered, concentrated force, or approached beyond effective defensive range. Renaissance geometry now moved from drawings and treatises into ditches, ramparts, and carefully calculated fields of fire. At the heart of that system stood the bastion, a pointed projection extending from the main defensive line. Unlike a round tower, its angled faces allowed defenders to fire along the neighboring curtain walls. Attackers approaching one section could therefore be exposed from the side by positions on an adjacent bastion. Properly arranged, the projections reduced dead ground where assault troops or sappers might otherwise find shelter. Crossed lines of defense made the space before the wall more important than the wall's sheer vertical face. The star outline was not decorative symmetry, it was a practical answer to the geometry of approach and defense. The dimensions demanded careful calculation, because a bastion worked only as part of a connected network. If neighboring positions stood too far apart, their weapons could not cover the entire intervening wall. If placed unnecessarily close, they consumed labor, land, guns, and money without adding equivalent protection. Engineers adjusted faces, flanks, and distances to the effective range of the defenders' weapons. Terrain complicated every calculation because rivers, slopes, roads, and existing buildings could disrupt an ideal geometric plan. Francesco di Giorgio Martini and members of the Sangallo family helped turn such calculations into a formal body of military knowledge. The main wall was only the inner edge of a much broader defensive landscape. Engineers dug a deep ditch and used much of the excavated earth to build the ramparts behind it. Beyond the ditch, a long, gentle slope called the glacis rose toward the outer works. Assault troops crossing that open ground had to advance upward while remaining visible to defenders. The crest concealed much of the lower fortification until attackers had already entered a carefully observed approach. The slope could also carry poorly aimed cannon shot above the lower protected walls, reducing the value of distant bombardment. Triangular ravelins added another barrier by occupying the ditch before the curtain wall between neighboring bastions. Each ravelin shielded part of the main defense and created another position from which the approaches could be covered. An attacker might cross the glacis, descend into the ditch, and still face an outwork before reaching the central rampart. Covered ways let defenders move along protected routes near the ditch, while counterscarp galleries could direct fire into the trench. Capturing one outwork did not end the problem because the main bastion still overlooked the newly occupied ground. Hornworks and crownworks extended selected fronts even farther when terrain or strategic importance justified the additional expense. For an assaulting soldier, the system presented a sequence of obstacles rather than one decisive wall. The open glacis offered little cover, the ditch interrupted momentum, and the ravelin divided the attack. Bastions and outworks placed defensive positions at different angles, forcing troops to watch several directions while trying to move forward. Even a captured outer work could expose the attackers to another prepared line behind it. Engineers had transformed the assault route into a managed sequence whose dangers appeared one layer at a time. The design's strength came from delay, overlap, and the controlled exhaustion of an enemy's time, labor, ammunition, and cohesion. This did not make star forts impossible to capture, and competent besiegers developed methods for reducing them. It did make every approach more deliberate, often stretching a siege across weeks or an entire campaigning season. Armies needed engineers, laborers, heavy guns, ammunition, food, and secure supply routes before a serious operation could begin. A fortified town could block a road or river crossing even when its garrison was smaller than the surrounding field army. Seasonal weather and disease could defeat besiegers whose trenches advanced more slowly than the campaign calendar. Defensive architecture therefore became a strategic instrument that shaped movement far beyond the range of its own cannon. Palmanova, founded by Venice in 1593 on the Friulian plain, became one of the clearest expressions of the new design. 9 bastions formed a disciplined star around a city planned as part of the same geometric order. Streets radiated from a central polygonal plaza, connecting civilian space with the defensive perimeter. Ditches, outworks, and a glacis continued the pattern beyond the main wall. Gates and roads were fitted into that order, so movement through the city served both daily life and defense. From above, the settlement appears almost abstract, yet every line emerged from military requirements and Renaissance faith in measured proportion. The Republic intended Palmanova to strengthen its frontier against pressure from both Ottoman and Habsburg power. Military engineer Giulio Savorgnan supervised the defensive conception, while Vincenzo Scamozzi contributed to the plan within the walls. A later legend claimed that a spiderweb inspired the radial arrangement, though the story is better treated as tradition than evidence. What the legend captures is the impression of deliberate order created by the completed city. The documented planning process already explains why a radial scheme appealed to builders seeking controlled routes and measured sectors. Palmanova still preserves that geometry and forms part of a UNESCO World Heritage listing devoted to Venetian defensive works. Across Italy, fortification became a field in which prominent artists, architects, mathematicians, and soldiers could work on the same problem. Michelangelo designed defenses for Florence during the siege of 1529, applying his spatial intelligence to exposed ground and artillery threat. Baldassare Peruzzi worked on the fortifications of Siena, while the San Gallo architects became widely sought specialists. Their designs joined practical experience with the analytical habits of the Renaissance. Workshops, courts, and siege sites circulated ideas between specialists who approached the artillery problem from different disciplines. When foreign rulers wanted modern defenses, they often recruited Italian expertise or studied Italian plans. That movement of engineers explains the French term tres italienne, meaning the Italian outline or plan. By the 1530s, related bastion defenses were appearing beyond the peninsula, adapted to local terrain and political needs. The technology traveled because the artillery problem was not uniquely Italian. Any state defending a city, port, crossing, or frontier faced the same relationship between low walls, angled fire, and protected depth. Engineers altered dimensions and materials, but the underlying demand for mutual support remained recognizable across regional variations. Italy provided the early laboratory, but Europe soon turned the experiment into a continental competition. In the 17th century, Sébastien Le Prestre de Vauban became the most influential French practitioner of the bastion tradition. Born in Burgundy in 1633 to minor nobility, he advanced through demonstrated skill during an era of almost continuous warfare. He had fought during the Fronde, suffered wounds, changed allegiance, and then entered the service of Louis XIV. Across his career, he worked on or inspected hundreds of sites and shaped roughly 160 major fortification projects. Long journeys between frontiers let him compare formal plans with the behavior of actual ground and existing towns. His achievement lay less in inventing a new principle than in refining inherited principles with relentless attention to terrain and measurement. Vauban's designs are often described through 3 systems, although his actual work responded closely to each location. His first approach combined bastions, ravelins, and a covered way into a carefully balanced defense. Later designs separated some defensive elements, adding layers that prevented one captured position from exposing the entire fortress. His most elaborate arrangements placed defensive works behind other works and multiplied the problems facing an attacker. The sequence forced besiegers to repeat trenching, artillery preparation, and assault against positions that remained mutually connected. Each system sought depth without losing the overlapping fire that made the original Italian design effective. Vauban also understood that no fortress could be evaluated honestly without studying how it might be attacked. He organized sieges around parallel trenches dug at measured distances from the defenses. Zigzag approaches connected those lines while reducing exposure to fire from the fortress. Artillery advanced with the trenches, and sappers prepared positions or mines as the besiegers closed the distance. Each parallel created a protected base for the next approach, converting exposed ground into a controlled sequence of labor. This method was slow and highly organized, but it gave commanders a repeatable process for dismantling the geometry they confronted. Reports credit Vauban with more than 40 successful sieges and no failed operation under his direct command. The exact reputation reflects both his skill and the powerful state that supplied his campaigns. More important was the feedback between offense and defense in his career. Weaknesses discovered during a siege could be addressed in the next fortress, while new defensive layers demanded revised methods of approach. That cycle made his mature works accumulated responses to recurring operational problems rather than fixed formulas imposed everywhere. He became, in effect, both the builder and the most disciplined critic of the bastion system. Louis XIV used this expertise to reinforce a belt of fortified places along France's vulnerable frontiers. These towns guarded routes, supported armies, and made territorial claims physically durable. Neuf-Brisach, begun near the Rhine in 1697, joined a planned community to a complex defensive perimeter. Its streets, gates, ramparts, and outworks belonged to one coordinated military landscape. Supply, troop movement, civilian circulation, and controlled entry depended upon the same planned relationship between center and edge. The fortified town was no longer a civilian settlement hiding behind walls. Urban life and defensive design had become structurally inseparable. The Dutch Republic developed its own influential approach in terrain where water could become part of the fortification. Low ground allowed engineers to combine bastions with flooded ditches, canals, and controlled inundation. Bourtange, completed in 1593 during the 80 Years' War, guarded the road connecting Germany with Groningen. Its geometry and surrounding water helped it resist a French attack in 1672. At Coevorden, polygonal defenses and radial planning offered another model studied across northern Europe. Dutch thinkers, including Simon Steven and Menno van Cohoorn, refined a tradition that sometimes competed with French practice and sometimes borrowed from it. Maurice of Nassau linked fortified positions to systematic training and organization in the field army. That combination mattered for a smaller republic facing states with greater resources. Forts protected critical ground, while disciplined troops moved between them and used the time those defenses created. The Star Fort became one part of a larger military system rather than an isolated architectural achievement. European empires carried bastioned fortification across oceans to ports, river mouths, islands, and colonial frontiers. Spanish builders used related designs from the Caribbean and the Americas to the Philippines. Portuguese engineers constructed comparable works in Brazil, Africa, and India. A relatively small garrison with artillery could dominate a harbor or crossing from a prepared position. These structures supported imperial control, while also becoming targets, contested spaces, and lasting evidence of colonial power. In the Mediterranean, modernized fortifications influenced the struggle between Christian and Ottoman powers. Defenses on islands such as Corfu and Rhodes demonstrated how terrain, artillery, and protected depth could reinforce one another. At Malta in 1565, the fortified positions held by the Knights of St. John contributed to resisting a major Ottoman siege. Such examples did not guarantee victory, but they raised the price and complexity of attack. By the late 16th century, the Italian solution had become a technology with consequences far beyond Italy. Historian Geoffrey Parker later connected the spread of these fortifications to a broader transformation sometimes called the military revolution. In heavily fortified regions such as the Low Countries, armies could not safely ignore every defended town behind their advance. Campaigns became chains of sieges, supported by roads, magazines, engineers, and taxation. Battles still mattered, but logistics and the reduction of strongpoints often controlled the pace of war. Geography influenced whether conflict became a slow contest of fortified corridors or a more mobile search for decision. The financial burden was immense, because a major fortress required years of labor, specialized knowledge, artillery, and continuing maintenance. A network of strongpoints could consume a large share of a state's military resources. Yet rulers also feared the cost of leaving strategic routes exposed to an enemy equipped with modern guns. Fortification therefore encouraged an arms race in earth, brick, stone, water, and administrative capacity. Wealthier states could sustain broader systems, while smaller powers faced painful choices about which cities and borders deserved protection. The pattern was not uniform across Europe. Regions crowded with fortified towns often produced methodical campaigns in which each defended point interrupted movement. More open areas, including parts of Eastern Europe, allowed armies greater freedom to maneuver and sometimes increased the importance of field battles. Commanders had to understand both environments because a strategy suited to one could fail in the other. The trace italienne shaped warfare most strongly where political geography placed valuable towns close together. Its influence came from the network as much as from the design of any single fort. By the middle of the 19th century, artillery again altered the balance that defensive engineers had built. Explosive shells did not merely lodge in packed earth like many solid projectiles. They burst within or against the works, scattering material and creating craters that repeated shots could enlarge. Rifled barrels also improved range and accuracy, allowing attackers to concentrate on selected points from greater distances. The low earthen fortress now confronted weapons capable of attacking its depth instead of merely striking its surface. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871 exposed this change with particular force. Prussian rifled steel artillery and explosive shells reduced French positions far more quickly than earlier designers had expected. Fortifications intended to delay an army for long periods could be damaged or compelled to surrender within days. Engineers answered with lower polygonal forts, dispersed works, buried magazines, and eventually reinforced concrete. The star fort did not vanish at once, but it ceased to define the most advanced form of defense. Later, systems inherited parts of its logic while responding to industrial weapons, railways, tanks, and aircraft. The French Maginot Line represented one distant echo, a prepared barrier intended to control likely avenues of invasion. Its strongest sectors performed their defensive role, but German forces in 1940 concentrated elsewhere and bypassed much of the system. That episode did not prove that fortifications were useless. It showed, as earlier centuries had shown, that a fixed defense succeeds only within a larger strategy of terrain, mobility, and adaptation. Many bastion towns survive because their military geometry became part of their civic landscape. Palmanova remains inhabited in Italy, Bourtange has become a Dutch village, and Neuf-Brisach still stands near the French-German border. Seen from the ground, their walls can seem like ordinary embankments, gates, and open spaces. Seen as complete plans, they reveal the extraordinary coordination of angles, distances, and overlapping protection. Their survival preserves the physical record of an age when mathematics was written directly across entire settlements. The trace italienne endured because it answered one technological shock with a complete reorganization of space. It replaced the isolated high wall with depth, mutual support, controlled approach routes, and defenses designed as connected systems. Better artillery eventually overcame that arrangement, just as cannon had overcome the medieval castle. Yet the underlying lesson outlived the star-shaped ramparts. Strength does not come from adding more of the same protection. When the threat changes, survival depends on redesigning the structure around a new understanding of force.